Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to Selection for Digitization, the title of today's webinar. My name is Rima Ghanem, and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar helps archivists and collection administrators in their selection process prior to digitizing their records. The session introduces some appraisal concepts. It also looks into the different values of archival records and addresses privacy and copyright issues that are important to be aware of before jumping directly into digitizing collections. May I also note that this is the third webinar in the series Digitize Your Collections, so if you missed our two previous sessions, they're available for you on the Lucidia website under the resources section. Now, before we begin, allow me to introduce our company and our remarkable guest speaker. Lucidia is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our solutions help manage and deliver access to organizational collections and knowledge, and we serve a broad range of organizations of all sizes and budgets. Presenting this webinar is archives expert Margot Note. Margot is a certified archivist and records manager. She is a consultant with 20 years of experience in the national and international sectors. Margot is also an author and a popular guest for Lucidia's webinars and Think Clearly blog. Margot, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'm excited to talk about selection for digitization because I feel like this is the meat of what we're talking about. There's a lot of decisions that we make before we digitize that really influence the success of a digitization program or initiative. And so selection is something that is really can be a deal breaker. So I want to give you some things to think about when you're thinking about doing selection for digitization. So appraisal for digitization or selection for digitization, we're really trying to match the institutional priorities to the collections and representing history with enduring value. So a very representative history, perhaps a hidden part of history or a hidden collection that you have. And I really want to emphasize that you're choosing collections that match your institutional priorities. There's going to be some selection factors to think about, but we really want to think about, since we can't digitize everything, it's wildly expensive and it's not necessary. We want to make sure that we're selecting the collections that are going to have the most impact for being digitized. So appraisal or selection, in this case, I'm talking about appraisal, both archival appraisal and appraisal for digitization. There is some overlap, but I do want to talk about what appraisal means. So it's looking at the provenance of a collection. Where did it come from? What was kind of the chain of custody of the collection? Is it an important collection compared to other collections that you have? What is the content? I mean, that's pretty obvious. Like, what do you have? What type of formats do you have? Is it photographs? Is it text? Is it audio visual? What exactly do you have? We're looking at both the authenticity and the reliability of the sources. So are these authentic and reliable materials? And when we digitize them, we're going to be looking later on a little bit into digital preservation to make sure that we uphold that authenticity and reliability. Looking at order. So how are things organized? Thinking about especially making sure things are in the correct, what I advise is making sure things are in the correct order before you digitize your collections. So that way, you know, you have an orderly physical collection and an orderly digital collection. We're looking at completeness. So I think what happens when things are digitized, which is understandable, they kind of exist in isolation. They exist as an item level document. But of course, archives are all about context, all about that group listing. So when you are making selections, are you digitizing the complete holdings? Are you doing only selections or kind of the gems of a certain collection? Kind of thinking through those decisions. We're looking at the condition of the material. So how fragile are they? Do they require special handling, and the idea of that you only want to handle something once to get it digitized? And if you digitize it at a high enough resolution, which we talked about in previous webinars, then we don't have to kind of keep on going back and touching and handling the materials. And of course, digitizing materials is important because then people don't have to handle the physical item anymore. They can just look at that digital copy at their leisure. And then value, both looking at the historical value, obviously the enduring value, but looking at the fiscal value, like how valuable is this material in the scheme of things. And I think value for me is kind of the whole realm of it. So kind of the historical value, the artifactual or evidential value, and also the fiscal value too. So one thing to think about during appraisal is, of course, when you're tying your selection to what you want to digitize, we're looking at kind of the mission statements of the organization, the acquisition criteria, the collecting strategies. So are you a repository that has traditionally been kind of a passive custodian of records? Are you proactively seeking relationships that would fill in some of those historical gaps of your materials? What does that look like? You know, of course, a lot of times people who are donating materials to archives usually typically have some sort of wealth or prestige. So how are you kind of representing the historical record in your collections? And how can we use digitization to fill in those historical gaps? And then of course, documentation. We always like to have a collection that's digitized that has a ton of documentation that we can use for metadata, that we can make sure that we have custody of the materials, you know, a copyright of the materials, which we'll talk about. So that's something to think about as well. And then of course, it's being flexible. I feel like archivists are kind of I feel like a gymnast at times, or like a yogi, because the archival process and making these decisions is so subjective. It's not just one simple solution. So when I'm talking today about selection, I'm giving kind of an overall view of things to think about. But of course, you're going to be making sure that everything I'm talking about is bespoke to your organization. So we do want to accommodate the changing definitions of historical value. We want to think about encouraging greater consistency of the collections and then ensuring accountability too. So making sure some of those decisions are flexible. And of course, as you're working with a collection, I feel like you're constantly kind of reinventing what you're finding in these collections as you go through them. So the question to ask is, so what? So you can think of it either, that's a great Crass song, that's also a great Miles Davis song. You're thinking, so what? Why? These are kind of the questions that we're asking. Why should I save this? Why should I digitize this? You know, what are the factors that make you want to digitize? And then, you know, why should I save this? So why does this repository want to save this or to preserve it through digitization? So the first question really addresses the value, kind of the material as value as evidence. So why is this historically significant? Why is this worth preserving? And then the second question really assesses the appropriateness for the repository. So is this collection representative of your collections? Is it something that's going to draw new users? Are your current users going to find this newly digitized collection valuable? So you really want to kind of ask, so what? And I say that as well because the decision makers are thinking that as well. So I think as archivists, we obviously understand to preserve things, and it becomes almost like second nature to us. Like that seems just like an obvious thing that, yeah, we should preserve historical things. But of course, we have to articulate that value to people that hold the strings of, you know, money in our organization, that make decisions, that can connect the organization to donors that will give money to digitize things. So we really want to have really an argument in our minds why we're selecting certain collections to be digitized. But we also want to achieve a balance. So we're looking at both the enduring values of a collection and the usefulness of it. A usefulness in kind of many ways. Usefulness for us as an archivist. So if we know a collection is constantly being asked about, if we digitize it, then people can look at it 24/7 on our website, that we don't have to constantly be pulling those files or answering those questions. But then it's also useful for users. So what are things that people are asking for? What are collection that can kind of raise the profile of repository? What are kind of the simple wins, you could say, of digitization? We also want to balance that against the maintenance. So when we think about digitization, and I'm, guilty of it too, I think of scanning or photographing things as that being digitization. But of course, we have to think about how do we preserve these files over time? How do we create metadata and description, which is a huge labor-intensive process? And then how do we make these files sustainable in the long term? Because digital files are inherently fragile. And then also management costs. So it's not just that we're digitizing something one time and we're done. I mean, that's an outlay of money, but then the money that it takes to maintain it over time with storage, any type of digital preservation strategy that you do, maybe specific software that you use for sustainability. So kind of what does that look like? So we really want to kind of balance, again, asking, so what makes this particular collection or subset of collection worth digitizing and investing all this money? What will it do, and what will it kind of cost in the long term? So I want to kind of take a little bit of a step back from these ideas and really talk about values. So really kind of digging deep into some of these subjective things that you should be thinking about when you're thinking about selecting for digitization. So of course, archivists know about kind of primary values and secondary values. So the primary values are kind of the immediate creation, administrative, legal, fiscal. This is for, let's say organizations or for personal files. An example that I always, when I was trying to explain this to students, is the example that I always give is when me and my husband went to City Hall for our marriage license, we got a little ticket, kind of the ticket that you would get when you're visiting a bakery. And that ticket, the primary value or the primary purpose of that ticket was to keep kind of an orderly line for this kind of bureaucratic, kind of non-romantic signing of a marriage license. But I kept that ticket and I put it in a locket because it has a romantic value. That's kind of its secondary value. Once we got to the clerk, the purpose or the value of that ticket lost all meaning, but then it became kind of this secondary value. So that's where archivists thrive. That's why we use materials. There's a secondary value. So it's after the first purpose completion that we have these materials. And secondary values are required for historical research, and they're evidential and informational. So another example I'll give is I was reading something about kind of a colonial home. There was, maybe this is colonial Williamsburg, there was a house inventory that was made of a home that was kind of an upper middle class home of its time, where people were traveling. They had kind of knickknacks and other, like a butler's pantry. So it was an inventory of kind of the household goods that were going up for auction after the death of a patriarch or a death in the family. So that was the primary value. That was the primary purpose of that inventory, was to, we're going to have an auction, we're going to sell off these silver candlesticks or whatever, the set of silver. So that was the primary value. But the secondary value, of course, of historians can take a look at this inventory and they can start looking at, if they want to do some research on kind of material culture of the time. What were people buying of that class? What did the butler have? What were the items that were the everyday items? How did they kind of show their wealth to guests? So that was kind of the secondary value of that inventory. And of course, there's a million other reasons that we have for kind of primary or secondary values, but those are kind of some examples. So evidential values are kind of reflecting the record's importance as evidence. So it looks at the functions, the policies, the operations, and it's kind of the accountability rather than legal purposes. Like, we're not talking about legal evidence, though of course it might be, but kind of what were the decisions that were being made? What were the evidence? You know, if you have a business archives, kind of the major, you know, what was a CEO thinking of a particular time? What was kind of the thought process and what was kind of the interior dialogue? So that's kind of another type of value. And then we think about these factors are the context of the creation. Why was something created? Its original and subsequent use, its preservation history, its authorship. So who created this document? Do we know who created this document? What was the purpose? Like, what was the underlining factor that why this was being done? What was the message that was being given? And then who was the audience, or who was kind of is the audience obvious, or was it kind of a general audience? What did that look like? So that's where we're digging into some of those evidential values. Then of course, there's information value. So it relates to other uses like society or historical information, unique or permanent information, and for research purposes. So for example, information values, I always think about newspaper clippings where I have, this is especially so with, I think, private clients. They have newspaper clippings, and the clippings themselves are kind of in a bad shape. And it's not so much about that clipping itself, it's the information that it contains. It's an obituary for someone, or it gives, you know, specific, talks about an event and the people there, and then what happened. So that's the informational value that's in that artifact. So when you digitize things, and I'm talking about kind of getting in a little bit of the weeds of values because it gets kind of blurry with digitization. So traditionally, records are valued for their informational content, and digitization can obscure the evidential values. So only the information value remains without provenance in original order. So when you digitize something, when it exists kind of with the rest of the context that it has within that grouping, you get a sense of what that document is related to the other groupings of material. But digitizing things, in our minds, it kind of takes it out of that grouping, and then it kind of sits alone. So sometimes that context can get really blurry. And especially in digitized materials that are online, it's not like you're looking at a manuscript box in a reading room where you can kind of look at a specific piece of correspondence in relation to the other pieces around it. When you digitize it, it's just basically a PDF online. So it loses some of that context and some of that value. So that was kind of an interesting piece for me, because that's where it gets kind of tricky with thinking about the group context and then the individual item kind of being alone and that value being obscured. So there's also intrinsic value. So things like the physical or relational qualities, which could be individual, family, organization, place, or event. There could be something, this item was owned by this famous person, or this has this book, or this piece of writing is inscribed by somebody. There's kind of intrinsic values in those materials. And we can think about intrinsic values as being the aesthetics, like how is something like beautiful? Is it a beautiful piece of art? Is it a beautiful photograph or a manuscript? What is the quality of the materials? What's the context, content? What's the usage of the materials? The market value, going back to kind of that fiscal value, the uniqueness of the item, the age of the item too. And I think this gets tricky too, because when you talk about archival items, people, I think, automatically, understandably, think very old, but of course, something that's archival that has enduring value could be created today. So sometimes that gets a little tricky. And then scarcity, like, is this the only known item, or is it the only piece of writing by a famous person in your collection? There's also artifactual values, so looking at the physical and the aesthetic rather than the intellectual content. So especially if you have something that's more of an artifact, let's say it's a 3D item or something that's beautifully created, you want to make sure that that digitization process captures that aesthetic, artifactual values as well. So thinking about selection, there are kind of some red flags where there's certain parts of the collection that you should maybe think about and maybe look for kind of a easier win. So obviously any collection that has no or little provenance or description, you would ideally want to have a collection. You want to digitize collections that you've already, ideally in the real world, that you have already processed and organized. That way you have the physical collection is wonderfully organized and the digital collection is wonderfully organized. This makes me think of a recent, I sent out a bunch of stuff from a client of mine to a vendor to digitize. And before I did that, I really made sure to put, there's a lot of correspondence and a lot of kind of dated materials. I made sure to organize all of that collection in a chronological order by subject or by folder, because I knew I wanted my client to be able to look at the physical materials in order, but then also look at the digital in order too. I didn't want to create two messes. A lot of times I find that sometimes digitization projects, you can also kind of piggyback other projects on top of it, where you can use a digitization project to do more description or to research more. But ideally, you'd want a collection that you know well, that has some description, that there's, it's not kind of a mystery collection that you have. You're also looking for, this is another red flag, any collection that has significant conservation, research, or arrangement needs. So again, the unprocessed collection is not really an ideal candidate. You would want to arrange it, at least in some better sense. If something is horribly damaged, digitization can help with the preservation of that artifact, but if it's really in rough shape, that funding might be better for some conservation work. And then you don't want anything that you need a significant amount of research to look into to figure out what you have, especially if it's very subjective and it's related to creating a lot of metadata. You don't want to digitize anything that you can find elsewhere. So sometimes, a lot of times that's duplicates. So if you have publications in your collections, or if you know that things have been digitized in the past, or there's something similar, obviously it's not kind of worth doing that. If there's access or usage restrictions, so if you have a collection that is, or pieces of, or parts of the collection that are closed for a period of time and restricted in some manner, I'd kind of leave that to kind of a future archivist to deal with, kind of work with, obviously digitize things that you can use immediately. This also goes back to copyright too, where you don't want to digitize things that you don't own copyright for. And then obviously collections that are too costly to acquire or to manage. I feel sometimes, this is a little bit less likely, but I feel sometimes because digitization is a lot of times tied to grants or for nonprofits to funding, sometimes there's kind of a pressure from a particular donor or to digitize things that maybe aren't the best fit or not the easiest to manage. I also feel too that a lot of people that are in decision-making capabilities think that once you digitize everything, it's all good and you never have to maintain it, and that digitizing everything is the best solution, where it really is about digitizing kind of the best of what you have. And a lot of the collection may not be worth it to digitize. So there's things to think about as well. I kind of call it like the ick factor. Like if there's parts of the collection that are just kind of culturally sensitive, that's something to for kind of an internal conversation. So anything that's culturally sensitive, cultural property, and materials related to Native Americans, people that are photographed in exploitative situations like prison pictures, mugshots, a lot of mental health pictures as well, obviously obscenity or nudity. Of course, I say this with kind of a grain of salt, because obviously there are images that are shocking, that are important to the historical record. I think of that, obviously that picture of the enslaved person with the horrible scarring on his back. I mean, that's like a shocking picture, but that was so important for the anti-slavery movement in the United States. But there is kind of some sensitivity. So you do want to think about, is this really kind of worth digitizing? Just something to think about as well. There are some donor restrictions too. So if you have a collection, and let's say you don't have a good deed of gift, or you don't have a deed of gift at all, which unfortunately is a huge legacy problem for a lot of repositories I work with, we do want to kind of take a step back and think about, is this worth going back to the donor to get that real deed of gift? A great example is I was on site with a client, and it was a really interesting kind of family collection that had some historical carte visites of famous people of the time. One was of Frederick Douglass, that I believe is pretty valuable and unique. And I was thinking about, well, what is the deed of gift for this collection? Because the collection is just fantastic, of kind of a Black history collection of a particular time period of this family that is just remarkably historically significant and remarkable. And the deed of gift was just someone scribbled, hey, you can have this collection, which is kind of defeats the purpose. I mean, it was at least a deed of gift, but so we had to think about, are we going to go back to the family? What will that look like? Is there family members to go back to? So of course, always have a deed of gift. But there's donor restrictions too. So the donor might have limitations on access or use. That deed of gift is also really important to get the donor to say, hey, I give this repository copyright. So every time someone asks to use this collection, or they're asking for permission to use, it's going to the repository, they're handling it versus the family handling it. And that's more, I think, an issue of kind of control and trust. So as a repository, it's gaining the trust and really building that relationship with the donor so that they feel comfortable with the repository taking on the pain in the neck aspect of the permissions process. And so that's sometimes talking with donors. And part of what I've been doing is I find myself increasingly kind of the matchmaker between private collections and repositories. And I see myself kind of explaining to the donors, because the repository will give the deed of gift, but sometimes it's hard to explain, like, why are we signing off on this? So I found myself as kind of that matchmaker to kind of talking with the donors, with the clients, to talk about, okay, this is what you're signing over with this. It allows the collection to be used. There's a historical collection that's out there, and then you're not always like pinged every time someone wants to use the collection. There might be parts of the collection that are closed for a period that obviously, you can wait to digitize later on. And then of course you want to make sure that you get the credit line right for the collection. So if you're digitizing things, making sure that credit line is there so that when that digital image is kind of out there in the world, people can find the collection and it's properly credited. So publicity is interesting because your right to privacy dies when you do. So there is kind of this idea of publicity associated with public figures, like the name, likeness, voice, persona, and other aspects. That can get a little tricky. It depends on who the donor is, where sometimes they or the estate can be kind of rigid about how they control the rights of that collection. It's a personality aspect too, like the amount of control, but then I think it's also if the estate, or especially if you're dealing with an estate, if the estate is relatively new versus older, I find that estates have kind of recently passed away. People are much more controlled about that publicity and that likeness. And then over time, they get a little bit more comfortable and they kind of have enough experience to get that comfort level. I was dealing with an estate of someone who had passed away about a year ago, who was well known in certain circles, and they're really clamping down on that, where I think in time, as they kind of, I mean, the death, well, it wasn't sudden, but this person was young and still very vital. So I think, you know, obviously you're dealing with grief and making these decisions. So that's what I found in the process too. So sometimes it's, again, building that relationship with the donor, with the creator of the collection, so that there's this trust, so that if you can decide to digitize those materials over time. There's also privacy too. So we want to protect from intrusion and disclosure, and privacy of people ends with death. And so it's interesting to see the laws related to the right to be forgotten. So if you think about, you know, when people are digitizing yearbooks from years ago, you didn't realize that, you know, a picture of you from a bazillion years ago would be available online. And this is obviously, you know, for politicians that have dressed in like blackface and, you know, horrendous, you know, or, you know, your local newspaper, you know, you're arrested as like a teenager or a young adult. And then suddenly when people Google your name, you're findable, right? So there's all different ways that we're still figuring out how privacy mixes up with digitization. But again, it's something to think about when you're thinking about selection, like, are you protecting the people of the records that you're digitizing? And this is the big one. This is, I feel like with selection, the number one thing is, as a repository, do you own copyright? Because there is no point in throwing away money to digitize things you do not own copyright for. So copyright is a limited monopoly, permitting authors to profit from their efforts, and eventually the public will use. And it's, again, it's interesting to watch the copyright laws, because certain organizations are kind of blurring what copyright looks like. And I think in the digital world, I think what we expect as copyright kind of traditionally is changing as well. And I should say, the average person and the average decision maker within an institution does not understand copyright at all. And that can be kind of a tricky conversation to talk that through. So there is some fair use, fair dealing. Fair dealing is more of a UK term, but it's the way that we can use materials that are protected without the owner's permission. So it has very limited purposes. So criticism, comment, reporting, teaching, scholarship, research. So if you're digitizing parts of a, you know, when I used to, like, my first real library job was working the reserves department at a college. So we were, you know, photocopying parts of chapters all the time and putting them, you know, on the reserves shelf. And that's fair use. You know, you can make 1 million copies of something for your classmates to use, or your students to use. It gets tricky, and this is where I think students get tripped up too, is what I used to tell my grad students is that, you know, in your thesis, you can have as much illustrations as you want, whatever you want, that's fair use. But if you decide to turn the thesis into a journal article or into a longer form a publication or part of a publication, you're going to have to get permission to use those photographs or those segments. So that's something to think about too, that maybe people don't necessarily understand, because, you know, we're used to finding everything online and using it right away. And I think copyright law will change over time due to how we use things, but we're still kind of catching up. So there are significant implications of copyright. So either the repository must have copyright or it's transitioned into public domain. Copyright law is something that is definitely beyond the scope of this webinar, beyond the scope of what I can advise. I always say, ask your legal counsel if you have any questions. You may wish to secure or investigate unknown copyrights, but thinking that could be a game changer. Sometimes you can't find who owns something. It's an orphan work. A lot of organizations have kind of gotten around that by having takedown notices. So they'll digitize something and then on their website, it says, if you think you're the copyright holder of this material, please let us know and we'll take it down. That's one way to do it. For collections that are historically valuable, but you're not really sure of who owns it. But I would say if you're just starting out with a digitization project, you really want to make sure that you have copyright, and that would be in the deed of gift. I feel like I've talked about this in other webinars as well, but I have a client who digitized, beautifully digitized a historical newspaper collection, and with the best intentions, digitized things, created a lot of metadata, uploaded it into a database, and that was all for naught because the owner of the copyright, the newspaper organization, kind of found out about it, was not happy about that, and they're figuring out how to resolve that. But that's so much money, that time and effort that went down the drain based on a pretty poor decision-making skills, where I think there's so much other, and I understand kind of the motivations of why they did it, or why they saw that the collection was valuable to digitize, but that was poor decision-making. And I think we're using that money now to really digitize things that are historically significant within that collection that the repository owns. That's the most important part. So really that's almost like number one of selection. Like, do you own copyright of it? So then it's also thinking about, with selection, is the current and potential use. So the collections that you choose to digitize should support activities, programs, exhibits, publications, events that you see kind of upcoming in the calendar, that you see as something that's being used. It enhances the institutional strength. So a collection that you want to be known for. They have the potential for enduring value as digital files. So knowing that the physical copy will be used and the digital copy will be used. And there's kind of two ways to go about that. So one is thinking about popular collections. What is currently being used the most right now that people are coming into your reading room that are asking questions about that aren't digitized? That, I think would go kind of up on that bulleted list of priorities for digitization. Obviously things that are, are going to be popular in digital format. But then also kind of the other side of that is looking at what are the collections that are underused, that people don't know about, that it's a hidden collection, that's something that if people only knew that it was there, that they would use, and they would use even more if it was available, if it was digitized and available online. So thinking kind of through both sides of that coin. So we want to also think about the context. So are the materials stable? Are they organized to optimize scanning? So as I said before, you want to make sure the collection is processed, ideally before you start digitizing. And then you have supportive records to facilitate that processing. So you have a deed of gift, you have a container list, you have notes about the collection, notes about the creator. That's really helpful as well. There are ways that sometimes you can digitize things that aren't fully processed. Like I was working with an organization to think through what it would take to digitize a lot of their collections that are legal records that have a lot of restrictions, as you can imagine. And they were processed, the physical collections were processed to a point. They were processed kind of at the folder level, but internally not the greatest, like not processed like chronologically within those folders. So something that we kind of talk through that process of digitization is that we would use, we would figure out what we wanted to digitize. So some of it was kind of based on particular cases that had a certain theme or subject to these cases. They would pull those boxes of records, take a look at what that inventory is, kind of at the folder level, and then kind of do kind of a quick and dirty processing of the box. So getting things a little bit more in order, just kind of going through, not spending days and days processing, but getting it into a good enough order so it could go to that digitization vendor. So that was kind of a way we got through kind of fully processing. But of course, ideally, you would want something that is already organized, already processed. And I think the exciting part of these projects is the partnership. So thinking about you're encouraging new usage between collections. The collections could be split among institutions that could be united, and developing critical mass of a subject-related record. So you might have kind of a piece of a collection, another repository might have another piece. I think about like James Baldwin. I think his collections or his materials are in 3 different areas because of how they were found and who owned them. And ideally, like digitizing for a researcher of James Baldwin, for example, like they wouldn't have to make 3 different reading room trips. If things were digitized and available online, you can look at kind of his whole works, behind your computer screen rather than traveling and doing all of that. Partnerships, I think, are good for funding too. So it kind of raises the profile of the repository if you can get great funding for digitizing. And I think even the process of going through that, of creating a grant for something to be digitized is really valuable. I have a client right now, they got back to me and they were going for a digitization grant, which unfortunately they didn't get. But the process of having to write, why they wanted it to be digitized, having an inventory of what they wanted, reaching out to vendors to getting like kind of a price point for what it would take, getting kind of a basic kind of workflow of digitization. They've never really done a project like this before. So even that process raised their profile and gave them a little bit of confidence so that next time they have some feedback on the grant, next time they were encouraged to apply again, they have things already done. And of course, with grants, there's a lot of boilerplate language that you can use and reuse. So the grant making process is wonderful because even if you don't get the grant, you still win. You still, that time and effort is worth something. And kind of building that partnership, getting known as an organization that is looking for that money, I think is valuable too. So of course, there's kind of organizational priorities. So we're examining the motives for initiating digitization projects. So there is some, thought behind why we're choosing one collection over another one. We're also thinking about a supportive institutional framework. How can this digitization project help the organization? How can it make your life as an archivist easier? How can you help the users that they have those digital assets? They don't have to go to the reading room. They don't have to ask questions. They can kind of have a self-serve model for some of your collections. There's funding opportunities. I think more than ever, getting a digitization grant is sometimes kind of the easier grant to get. And there's much more, there's different price points. I mean, obviously there's, if you're working with, the Mellon Foundation, you can get, 6 figures worth of funding, but even kind of the smaller digitization grants, like the one that I was talking about with my client, it was only for $5,000, which that's a nice, for kind of a first time grant application that was right sized for that organization at that point. And then you refine selection throughout a project. So as you're working with a collection, as you've kind of selected what you want to digitize, you get to know that collection a little bit better, and you get some feedback about, what's being asked for, what's being used, and you can kind of refine some of those selection priorities as you work through the project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all this valuable information, Margot. It's really helpful. And to our viewers, a complimentary piece to this webinar would be Margot's latest book, The Digital Decisive Moment, Transformative Digitization Practices. This publication is an excellent resource for individuals and organizations looking to digitize their collections. So don't hesitate to download your free copy at lucidia.com/the digital decisive moment, as you can see on the screen. And if you'd like to reach out to us, whether you have questions or comments, here are our contact details. We're always happy to hear from you. Now, on behalf of the Lucidia team, I thank you all for attending today. And until next time.